So welcome, 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 our beloved colleague Sara. We so appreciate your leadership. And as always at Setsi, we begin by acknowledging, giving thanks to our creator, acknowledging the various stewards of the lands that we're on, acknowledging all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So Sara, please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers and share a bit about your remarkable work.
Hi, thanks so much for having me here today. Really, just so much gratitude for you and the work that you do, and for this chance to have this conversation in this space here. So thank you for that, and thank you for that beautiful opening and just reminding us of why we're here and where we need to go as well. So Sara Wolfe, and I have this really kind of background, but first and foremost, who I am as a person is I'm an Anishinaabe. I am a member of Brunswick House First Nation, but I grew up in Northern Ontario. I am now currently in Toronto and have been here for about 21 or so years, which feels like a lifetime, and it's longer than I've ever lived anywhere else. But my children are solid Torontonians. I will always be a Northern Ontario girl at heart. I am a mother. As I said, I have two beautiful daughters who are in their teenage years, which is, its own set of joys and challenges. And then I am a daughter. I have a mother here in Toronto as well who lives here. And so I'm from the waters of Evelyn Wolfe, who's from the waters of Mariah Nimke, who is from the waters of Nellie. And yeah, so that's who I am and where I come from. What I do for work and what I make my living doing is, of course, is also sometimes of interest to people. And so I have a deep rooted history and background in healthcare. And so I'm a nurse, I'm a midwife, and I've worked for about 25 or more years, as a healthcare provider, and that's been the mainstay of my career. So most of it being around, perinatal health, meaning like that pregnancy, that birth year experience, right? That pregnancy journey, from getting pregnant to being pregnant to birthing babies into the world and to supporting new families in that first year of their journey. And then I've also done a lot of population health and really worked to kind of build communities through that creation story, that reenactment of our original creation stories. And so lots of cool stuff that I did as a midwife, starting the first urban Indigenous focused midwifery practice, opening a birth center, a healthcare facility that was grounded using an Indigenous leadership and governance framework. It was the first one in Canada, but open to the mainstream. We wanted really everyone there. We used an argument where if we make services more accessible to the people who've been most underserved by our systems, then we're actually making services more accessible for everyone, right? Because if we're using a trauma-informed approach and accessibility and ethics and justice and self-determination as the basis and the framework for how we're operating, then everyone gets to see things better and to have better access. And so that's been thriving for about 10 years now. And then I segued into impact investing and social finance when I led the Indigenous Innovation Initiative at Grand Challenges Canada. Really, saw that kind of rise of supporting Indigenous-led initiatives and new businesses as, also being a midwife, right? Because it's really around, conceiving these ideas, gestating them, birthing them, and then taking care of them. And so really, how do I use all of those skills I had from midwifery around supporting people and wrapping those supports around that they need so that they can feel nurtured as nurturers?
That's absolutely remarkable. I really appreciate your visionary leadership and the way we're able to conceptualize that and frame decades of work in such a. I just love storytelling, and I love griot culture, and I most importantly appreciate the way you shared coming from the waters of your ancestors and your ascendants. Like, that was absolutely remarkable. And I just give thanks for all that you are and all that you do for so many. Yeah. So what inspires you about your current work? I'd love to hear what has you curious right now and what's inspiring you.
So for the last little while, I've been doing freelance consulting work, and most of it's been around governance and advisory type level work and working with different boards, primarily not-for-profit boards, and also working with higher academic institutions, we'll call them, but at a governance level. And I think what's exciting me is this idea of like really transformative governance, and how can we start looking at creating more inclusive governance where the people who are most impacted by the decisions are actually reflected into the structures, and not in a way where it's just about getting brown bodies or racialized bodies or queer bodies or whatever that is into board positions. Because for me, like, that's just an assimilation practice, right? Maybe a bit more sophisticated assimilation practice, but I'm not interested in how do we just get more people succeeding in a mainstream model that's, what got us into the trouble in the first place in terms of like the challenges we have across climate and social injustice and, the shitstorm that we're in as a world right now, right? We don't need to have more people practicing Western styles of, economics and education and healthcare and just ways of being in the world. What we need is to actually really rekindle those ancestral ways and those other ways that we have of knowing and being, whether they're Indigenous or from other diverse cultures and practices, so that we can create a more inclusive world where we really honor and respect each other, because we're not defaulting to one dominant system. And so how do we bake that into the governance, and at a fundamental level, and bake it kind of throughout an organization so we can keep challenging those systems and structures that continue to oppress and uphold that dominant system, so that we can really transform everything. But it does start with like each and in every different group that's operating, and looking at practicing and challenging those spaces in the medium space. And that's where I'm finding excitement, is working with those not-for-profits to really transform their models and systems, so we're less dependent on the good intentions, and we're actually creating spaces where everyone gets a sense and a feeling that they belong.
That's beautiful. My wife always shares that the matrilineal frameworks are always so much more powerful in terms of governance. She's always like, why do priests and popes and imams and sheikhs and judges all wear robes? I wonder, so in terms of governance, I always think that definitely the leadership that we have needs to not just be more just and accessible and inclusive and diverse and equitable, but definitely needs to completely be non-Western, because we've seen where that model has brought us in terms of colonialism, capitalism, and ultimately imperialism. So once again, I give thanks for your leadership, your transparency, your candor, and all the work that you're doing for so many. So my next question is, what challenges and barriers do you face in your work, and how are you and your team working to overcome some of these challenges?
Yeah, well, I don't have a team right now, which is kind of fun, being just me and working with different groups that have teams. And so that's not one of my big challenges at the current moment. But yeah, what are the challenges that I'm facing? Well, sometimes it's hard to not feel overwhelmed by how much work there is to do. And it really takes a lot of resilience, and resilience that is practiced by rest and recovery and healing, right? And how do you try and balance those things when we work in a world where we're socialized to have our worth really baked into how much we're doing, and not valuing that rest part and that healing part is an important component of what we do. And so I've been spending a lot of time really just reflecting on that and trying to find space for rest and healing as an important part of what I can contribute to the world. Because there's a lot going on, and there's an urgency that is always in front of us to move things forward, right? But a problem is still going to be a problem when we come back from that rest, and we might be better positioned to be able to deal with it.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I'm one of those people that tend to take on a lot, and I have a bit of yes-itis in terms of, but definitely my wife once again always reminds me, rest is a form of resistance. It's one of her favorite books. And
Yes.
yeah, and that concept of rest being a form of resistance really resonates, especially the way what you just shared around rest, recovery, and healing, and how much we do should not be how we weigh our value and our contribution in our community. So definitely, once again, I give thanks to all those actionable insights and remarkable jewels. I really appreciate you.
Your wife sounds like a smart person. I think I feel like I need
Oh,
to have lunch with her.
after 20 years, she's not as smart. She's tolerant, patient, compassionate, loving, but definitely brilliant. Oh my goodness.
Hold
Yes.
on to that one.
Yeah. So how do you feel about the future of social innovation, social impact, and impact investing in Canada? Even though those are three different things, I wanted to conflate. Yeah.
To not get overwhelmed by all of the challenges that we have in our world right now, right? But the first business I opened was the midwifery practice. It was called Seventh Generation Midwives Toronto. And seventh generation is an Indigenous kind of principle, Indigenous teaching that we have around looking back and looking ahead, right? So it teaches us that the context and the situation that we have in front of us today is because of the decisions that were made by 7 generations before us, right? Our ancestors, 7 generations before us, not just mine, all of our ancestors. That's what we have today, but it speaks to our responsibility to look to the future, right? Because our decisions and actions today will have their biggest impact 7 generations from now. So that's a huge responsibility, but it's also this reflection on how all of those are kind of asynchronous, right? And it's a cycle that keeps, repeating itself over and over again. And so we've been here before, and was reminded by a talk that I was at a few weeks ago, right? Our world has been here before. Everything happens in cycles. And so we need to learn from those lessons of our ancestors, but we're also taking responsibility for those spaces for the future. And it's easy to get trapped into a hopelessness because there is such an urgency of what's happening in the world. But we've been through this before. Also speaks to there's a need for hope. And so I've always stayed hopeful for the future. And, we have some prophecies within Indigenous kind of culture and teachings that's really around this kind of 8th fire prophecy, right? Where our children and the generations right now are, while we still have lots of challenges, there's an ever increasing number who've been raised with an awareness of their culture and a pride in their identity and a grounding in the teachings that, my generation and many before, certainly my mom's generation who went to residential school, didn't get to experience. And so when I see them practicing that intuitively in everything that they do, it just gives me and sparks so much hope in me. I also know that we're in this transition phase, right? There's an increased social awakening, and while there's lots of push back against that social awakening, whether it's Black Lives Matter and Indigenous lives matter, and idle no more, any of those kinds of pieces that are happening, not just even within our Canadian or North American Turtle Island context, but globally, there's also a social awakening that's happening. And I think there's a vibration that gives me hope that we're going to figure this out, and that 7th generation is actually where things are going to turn around. And so I stay hopeful. I stay hopeful for my children, for my grandchildren, for my great-grandchildren, but also for their great-grandchildren.
Ashe, amen, I mean, I couldn't agree more. As a husband, as a father of 4, I know I'll have grandchildren, and I think it's our obligation to leave the world better than we found it. So those principles of 7 generations and even prophetic words of wisdom. Once again, thanks for the jewels and the wisdom and the guidance and mentorship in this conversation. I'm so grateful, so grateful. Yeah. So what is your ultimate goal, and what does success look like and feel to you in your work?
Yeah. Well, I'm in a transition period right now, and people often ask me, like, what sector do you work in? And I mean, I work across sectors, right? Like, look at if you look at my CV, it's a bit of a mishmash of things that I've done in places that I've worked and where I've connected in. And I think it kind of speaks to what I want to be doing right now in this transition phase is to find places where I can fulfill my responsibilities to the 7th generation. And what that means to me is not that I have a responsibility over, but I have a responsibility to myself to work to my fullest potential. And so where can I put myself in a space where what I can contribute can have a meaningful impact for the seventh generation? And so that's where I'm at, is in this transition phase, and I'm building the skills and the tools and the things that will serve me in that journey, that it will be lifelong, to reaching my fullest potential for the seventh generation and fulfilling that responsibility. It's a bit of an abstract answer. I'm so,
No,
I don't know what to say,
apologize.
Victor, but like that's where I'm at, is like this transition phase is, the universe telling me that there's something big out there for me to be working on, because I know I have the skills and talents to be able to do something that's big and transformative. I've done it before and I will do it again. And I'm needing to be patient and waiting for what that exactly is. But I do know that it will be something that is me being able to use my talents to their optimum level.
Yeah, and I don't think that's abstract at all. It seemed very clear and concise to me. I felt it. So I give thanks. My second last question is specific around intergenerational collaboration. I find a lot of times this work, we're dealing with pervasive challenges that are generational struggles. And I'll meet elders in my community that sometimes feel young people aren't doing enough or may not see the value and contributions of some of the movements that young people are building. And then I connect with younger folks than me that feel they discovered environmental racism or discovered poverty, not realizing there's elders that we sit on their shoulders, have been doing this work for decades. So my question is, do you have any words of wisdom or guidance or jewels for folks coming up behind us, taking on work of social innovation, social justice, and trying to advance economic justice, or any of these terms we use in the sector: justice, access, inclusion, diversity, equity, whatever ecosystem makes the most sense for the context of this question? Do you have any words of wisdom for those young people?
I don't know if this is words of wisdom. I'm going to tell you a story instead. And it goes back again to my midwifery days when I was opening up the midwifery practice. And, my midwifery practice was really around, how am I going to best serve the Indigenous community? And I was new to Toronto. I didn't have a community here. My community had been either in Northern Ontario or in Ottawa, but I had to be in Toronto for whatever reason. And so I opened the doors and it's like, well, maybe they'll just come, they'll just find me. Of course, put out flyers and stuff, the usual communication tools, but those weren't working. And and so I decided to do some focus groups. Someone suggested I do some focus groups, and I went in and I brought together a group of people, and I asked, how do we reach the Indigenous community? How do we find Indigenous pregnant people so that I can provide them this really great care? And I learned lots of things in that, but the main thing that I learned was that if I wanted to recruit Indigenous families into my practice, that I needed to go and talk to the aunties and the grannies. So this is going back 20, 25 years. I did this, and they're like, go and talk to the aunties and the grannies, because when people find out something that's like a major transformative, life-changing event happening in their life, they go to the people that they trust, and that's the aunties and the grannies. And I know this is not just unique to Indigenous communities. Like every single group that I've talked to, like, oh yeah, the auntie network is strong. That auntie circle, you don't cross them. The grannies, you don't cross them. But that's who we trust, and that's who we go to, right? I think it's on us in our generation now is to remind those young ones that that's a teaching that we've always had, that you have to go to the aunties and the grannies, and then we need to make those opportunities available for them. We need to facilitate that space for them. But it is a responsibility of those young people, is to realize, oh, actually, I need to go talk to the aunties and grannies, get their trust. And then that's where I'm going to learn. As much as I learn from my peers and from the books and from the other spaces, it's going and sitting and having 1,000 cups of tea with those knowledge keepers that's going to really help me to see what have we already done. We don't want to repeat that cycle again too soon. The stuff that didn't work, we want to learn from it. So we have to bring them together. But I think it's on us to actually facilitate making those spaces available and really reminding the young people, like, actually, have you gone and talked to them over there?
That's absolutely beautiful. It's so funny. My mother has a prayer group that has a meeting every Tuesday and Thursday morning at 5 a.m. And these are aunties in Toronto, in Montreal, in Florida, in New York, in St. Lucia, like all over the world. And they gather to pray at 5 a.m. on the telephone. And it's a remarkable group because whenever someone's sick, like they have like a moment where they mention their name, and that auntie network and granny network, that's inspiring. And once again, it's in every culture since time immemorial. So it's so true. It's so true. It's so true. So true. So I give thanks for those insights. So my last question to you is, do you have any calls to action or closing thoughts for our listeners and our viewers?
Yeah, this is when, how do I be succinct in calls to action? Great question. Hard one to answer. Go and talk to the aunties and the grannies, right? We always need to be there with those spaces and bringing those faces and spaces together in this kind of, impact investing, social finance space. I really, if we have folks that are listening in that are in positions of power, is looking at how are we actually dismantling those power structures and creating more inclusive spaces that lifts and amplifies power, not seeing it as a diminishment of their power, but as a sharing of power for the greater good, right? I think that's one of my calls to action, is really making that space for those voices that haven't been seen and baking it into all of the things that you do, right from the governance to the policy to the processes to the actual delivery of those programs and services that get offered. But it's keep looking at how we can shift power.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I give thanks. I give thanks. I give thanks, Sara, for your leadership, your diligence, your tenacity, and all the wisdom you shared today. And as always at Setsi, we close the way we began this interview by acknowledging our creator, by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We acknowledge all our ancestors. We acknowledge all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And just to say, to acknowledge all of those ancestors, past and future.
Ashe, ashe, ashe.
Yes. I hope you get some rest this weekend.
Most definitely.
Okay.